relation to myself around this. I suppose I would see myself in relation to doing a PhD as very much a scholar practitioner, or something that I quite like to send on, which is academic. Because essentially I am a practitioner, and then also sort of building on within that. I'm a partner in the conflict engagement practice. I find that more and more that's almost the way I need to describe it because of the continuum and breadth of the work being done. And I'm 18 months into doing my PhD on a part-time basis. So I'm learning lots of things about my ability to manage time, essentially in relation to that, and just how much has to be done. So I think when Michael asked the question earlier on, have you read any articles in the last while, 19 the last week. So so it begins to feel like it's a big part of life. Again, I suppose one of the things to kind of say in relation to this is very much about, my research is about creating a shared understanding around workplace mediation and its impact and influence on organisations by working with others who are actually engaged in that area of work as well. I'm very struck by the fact that I put one definition, Paul obviously had a slightly different definition earlier on, and I think again that's one of the things that goes back to something Michael said earlier, which is actually, do we have sort of shared understandings and shared definitions around mediation? Also in relation to workplace, so that's I suppose one of the things to say that my research is very much based and focused on workplace, is the degree to which we have understandings around the extent to which there are issues there in chasing practice. So I'm using a very specific term here, which is that there are issues which involve individual employees, there are issues which involve groups of people working together, and issues that then involve collective bargaining processes. And in many ways, a lot of the literature around, if they even mention workplace, most of the literature at this point in time goes back to between the 1970s and the mid-1990s around labour mediation, and grievance is about as close as they get to other things outside of the collective bargaining process. That's the academic literature, so I'm not talking about practitioner literature. Why it matters, now I'm putting some of these things up that are there in the literature, but I mean, I think, you know, anybody who works in any area related to conflict is very well aware of the fact that there are huge costs. Obviously, the social capital element of it, which is all of those impacts which cannot be measured very often in money terms, but then in the American literature and the English literature, they'd also be saying that actually if you look at the workplace, that conflict in work, now there may be all kinds of arguments about what they're measuring and how they're measuring it, but you're talking an awful lot of money that goes into trying to manage situations where conflict is arising and loss of earnings for organisations around that. I suppose in relation to the opportunity that's there in relation to the research, again, as I said, there was a lot of research happened in relation to labour mediation in the 70s through to the 1990s, but less so in recent times. A lot of the focus has gone into alternative dispute resolution, and again, that's great, and that's moving in various other directions at this point in time. And again, just limited empirical studies around workplace mediation. And I would like to be able to make a contribution in relation to that, particularly from the, you know, using the example of what's happened within Ireland and within workplace mediation in Ireland. There's a lack of large-scale survey data. Now, I have to put my hands up and say that I am not a quantitative person by any stretch of the imagination. My preferences and in previous research I've done would have been very much qualitative work. But there is an absence there, and that's really important to recognise. There is a need, and this is what's being identified in the conversation at the moment, to actually capture changes in the work environment, because that isn't actually being reflected at this point in time. And how do mediation styles adapt to changes in situation? Because again, going back to something that Michael was referring to earlier on, that has come up through other presentations that we made in this room today, that, you know, sometimes it can be a sort of sense that is there simply a template that the mediator applies a style to a situation, or is the reality that actually mediators adapt to the needs of the people who they're actually working with? And there are different views around that, but very little empirical evidence of any sort outside of anecdotal conversation. And again, chasing practice with contractual mediators. So within workplace, there may be lots of other people who the literature would identify as being a group called emergent mediators, which is a lovely descriptor, yeah? So that's all the wonderful work that happens with managers and organisations, with people who engage to try to address address conflict, to get trained in mediation skills within organisations. But my particular interest probably goes with Paul's point about contract, the people who sign up to an agreement to mediate with parties within workplaces, so that it's very, very clear, and whether those people are internal to organisations or external to those organisations, and to try to understand a little bit about what's actually happening there. Again, I'm not plucking this out of the air. I very much want to join the conversation that's happening around this, but also, what leads to workplace mediation being engaged with by organisations, and having some understanding around that. The styles in use and the specific situations where different styles are being used. And again, Paul, the point being made earlier on about, is it conciliation, is it mediation? I mean, again, that's a big conversation that goes on through the workplace or labour literature around mediation. But equally, the characteristics that are there in relation to workplace mediation, because we know this anecdotally, but we don't have a map or a picture that actually allows us to say, these actually are the sorts of backgrounds that mediators are coming from, these are the sorts of styles in particular situations that are used, these are the sorts of situations being mediated. Because again, you'll often hear descriptors around, well, yes, obviously it's about disputes. But actually anybody in this room who's practicing workplace mediation knows that it's way beyond that people are being asked to engage within organisations. And so what can we understand and know about that? And then also, because it's my kind of interest as well, not only the outcomes from mediation, and I think again that goes back to maybe a point that was being made earlier on when Mike was talking about this emphasis sometimes on settlement, but actually what are those other outcomes in workplace mediation that are important to have acknowledged and understood, and the systemic impacts on organisations of the use of workplace mediation. And I can only make a start on that with my work, but I would hope to at least be able to make that start so it's there to be built on by people after. Why I think it's important, I suppose essentially that there are only anecdotal understandings at this point in time remain. Mediator style is a huge area which sort of spins around there, and in the literature I have to admit my own head is spinning very often by reading about it, and very often there will be these conversations which are, does anybody really care as long as mediation gets on and does what it does? But equally, if we can't explain and allow people the reality of self-determination in what they are choosing to enter into, I think that is a really important factor, and I think that's been coming up as a theme in the conversations here today as well. And again, that mediators work in a larger field of conflict engagement. And again, that's often not recognised in how the mediators very often influence organisations, or may not. And if, again, mediators don't see how that picture sits, and if organisations don't understand that picture, it can be very hard to make informed decisions about what is done at any point in time. I suppose I just wanted to put up a couple of pictures because they're the beginnings of drawing together some pictures that help me at the very least. But again, as I said there, that there has been this sort of, and it's not been an evolution. It's not as if those style or the approach to mediation has significantly sort of moved into one of these areas and then dropped all the others. It's actually that the continuum is that all of these are being used. Now in the literature they'll be saying it's 25 styles of mediation. I think Dale was examining some of those this morning as well. But I mean certainly that there's the kind of deal maker, more evaluative style, and is that conciliation, is that mediation? It's operating in the workplace. We need to understand that. We need to actually understand the sorts of situations where that's happening, and is that mediation? And then the more facilitative orchestrator style, where is that appropriate? The transformative, I mean again in the American literature, that would be the big battle that goes on between evaluative, facilitative and transformative, and again that argument that that's about workplace culture. Narrative, which to a large extent falls in part to transforming conflict, and then the strategic, the deep problem solving, when it goes beyond simply understanding the issues that exist between those individuals, but actually there are deeper issues that need to be explored, need to be surfaced and understood. And then this very common picture here is me attempting to distill in part using a man called Leonard Riskin, so I don't make claim down to elements of this and blending that a little bit with Alexander's meta model of mediation, just to try to put together the fact that for a workplace, there are this range of and continuum of different types of issues that potentially occur, and that there is a need to sort of understand the difference between that kind of problem intervention that might occur in a workplace and a more process intervention. And we just don't have any data that talks to that at this point in time, and that in itself I think is a struggle and something to be understood. I talked about that in terms of context and culture, that the need to understand it, but also to develop on. There are models in the literature. As a practitioner, I find it really interesting, can I say that? That as I look at models, it makes me question, and I think one of the things that really struck me was, again, something that Michael said earlier, which is that as I do this work, what it does for me is, as I'm engaging in mediations, I'm beginning to recognise far more clearly and to question myself around what approach I'm taking at any point in time based on the needs of people. And that doesn't mean that I significantly kind of shift or alter perhaps from what I would have done previously, but it certainly makes me reflect in very particular ways and recognise that actually I'm working across a lot of that continuum and what it is that's actually happening within there. My plan, I said to you, I'm not really a stats or quant person by nature. How I started with my research is by engaging with mediators, contractual mediators in focus groups, to hear from them and to listen to what they have to say in this area, and then met with coordinators of internal mediation services, and again to understand a little bit how that works and what's happening in those areas. The plan then would be to conduct a survey of at this point in time, identified 400 contractual mediators. Now that's people who say they practice in workplace, the degree to which there may be some people who are very experienced and there may be others who are less so. And then that last point in terms of will it be semi-structured interviews, there will be some work, and it probably much more qualitative than that, in working with more experienced mediators to have that understanding and grasp around it. And again, in building a map, and I suppose the map of the terrain, would be around the professional backgrounds and training of mediators, the types of mediators, what leads to mediation and the styles, the outcomes and the extent, which is one of the things that I was sort of talking about there. Simply to flag up to you that these are some of the places from which the population is being drawn in relation to the research itself, and that at this point in time then is the plan for doing that. The likelihood is at this moment in time, I said time at the very beginning of this, that the survey itself is more likely to happen in January or the early part of the new year, with the other work then building onto that. But I'm writing up the focus groups and the interviews at that point in time, because I have to say the people I met with, the people I spoke with, the people I listened to, were incredibly generous in their thinking. So that has been an enormously rich source of information, which I think will have huge value for people practicing in this area to be able to bring that out to people. So thank you all very much indeed. We appreciate you listening there, and